talked some about the upside benefits. We talked about some examples. I'd love to hear how a company could actually assess maybe their risk level and preparedness for another anomaly, which I'm sure is around the corner.
I mean, I think sometimes simply doing a post-mortem and saying, if we went through this again, if you knew a pandemic was coming sometime in the next 3 years, just as an example, what are the 3 or 4 things you do differently now? So you'd be a little less surprised. And chances are the things that you would do around that would be the same things you would do if you were to get hit with a storm, if you were going to get hit with some sort of economic problem. And so it's thinking about that and it's saying, what do we learn? Have we changed? So for example, are our communications any different? Part of the problem before was maybe we weren't as transparent and as open as we needed to be. Have we made that change? Before, it was very much command and control. We wanted our employees to do what we told them to do. We didn't want them to be independently thinking. Well, that didn't work so well.
Sure.
So what are we doing to help our employees be more autonomous? Are we providing them kind of the guardrails so they know what they can and can't do? But as long as they're within the guardrails, we're enabling them, equipping them to make decisions, to talk with each other. So it's providing that very basis and saying, are we there? And in the same way you would track an initiative, in the same way you would measure employee engagement, you can measure employee preparedness. Just a different set of questions.
Makes sense. And so it all starts with kind of doing a postmortem on what you did well, what you did wrong, where could you have improved, and of course, kind of building a plan from there.
And the one thing I was going to say, just like anything else, you have to learn from your experience. And it doesn't mean that everything's going to apply again, but a lot of the core things will. So, the worst thing people can do is kind of wipe their hard drives clean and say, okay, we went through this. This is never going to happen again. We're starting with a clean slate. Let's go back to the way things were. That's a recipe for disaster.
I agree. And also too, as you're talking, I mean, this seems like, being prepared is applicable, not just to global pandemics, things like 9/11, but, if you're in supply chain or you have a supply chain shortage that's, caused by a boat, blocking a canal, having a plan in place could help you kind of be better prepared for those situations as well. So I think it's a good point. A few more questions. I promise to be a lightning round. So how does a company that, they listen to this podcast and they say, hey, Jay, that makes a lot of sense. Where would they begin? How do they start the process?
So if they're going to do it themselves, I think the first thing is, doing a literature search and, just asking, put in Google, how do I prepare for a disaster? How does a company prepare for a disaster? There's a lot of resources out there. Second is talking to people like yourself and me and saying, we have assessments. I offer educational, so like a seminar, webinar, checklist. What are the things you need to think about? That there are resources out there to get you started. And then if you have questions, reaching out to people who do this type of work. And, I think, when you do that, part of it is, am I aware of the problem? Is it significant enough that I have to do something about it? And if those two things are happening, then you need to act.
Understood. Great point. And so once somebody does that, they're done, right? I mean, no more polishing off, dusting off the emergency book.
I'll 2 quick points. One, the only dumb question is the one you don't ask. And, I think people saw that, pretty broadly because they hadn't thought through certain things. The second thing is, I don't know if you were ever a Boy Scout. I went through Cub Scouts, didn't make it all the way through, but I always remember one thing, be prepared. And it was that whole idea of no matter what happened, a scout was prepared. I mean, you think about that little pocket knife we all had, you know, that could do about 100 different things. But by having that, you can get out of a lot of different situations.
Absolutely.
So, you know, kind of what's our pocket knife now?
Understood. No, it makes total sense. And finally, to wrap this up, how does a company, so you put together the plan, you maybe hire an expert like yourself, you put it together the plan, you know, how do you ensure that you stay prepared and resilient? Are you looking at this quarterly, annually? Like how does a company just kind of stay on top of this?
So again, in the same way you would do your strategy review, periodically you're saying, okay, how are we doing? You know, you run a drill and say, okay, what would we do if this happened? Let's just work. You know, it's kind of like companies have fire drills.
Right.
So you run a fire drill. You know, I think the last thing you want to do is get stale. You probably need to do this quarterly, semi-annually. It depends on the nature of your business, how quickly things are changing. But if you're doing it annually every 2 or 3 years, you waited too long and you're not going to be prepared. So I think it's getting into a cadence.
So the old adage of practice makes perfect, you know, applies here in the business world as well. And I totally agree. And again, as we're talking, I'm thinking about, you know, software companies and manufacturing companies, and literally those probably that have some sort of supply chain component. I would imagine they're probably most at risk for a situation such as COVID, and ergo should be more prepared and resilient in a situation, and not to kind of minimize how important it is for the software companies, but those that have kind of a physical good, I feel this should be top of mind for most.
No, I'd agree. Again, you know, each business is going to have a different driver,
Right.
you know, a different weak link in the chain that they have to protect. It's figuring out, you know, what are your potential weak links, shoring those up, or having a plan in case something happens. What do you do?
That's an excellent point.